I don't know. I hope I didn't do that. Because I'm teaching like the same material in another class, and I hope I didn't. I ended with one thing, and I hope I didn't miss the other thing. Yes. Okay. Oh yeah, we talked about the Gospels and the relationships. Yes. Synoptic, good. Talked about. Oh yeah. Okay, so this is it. Oh, I didn't get to Revelation, right? I didn't talk about the Apocalypse of John yet, right? It's talking about the letters. Is that correct, Mr. Cummings? Maybe. Yeah, because I remember mentioning Tertius, right? Tertius, the writer of Romans, right, Ms. Quesada? Tertius wrote Romans. Just want to make sure that I. Man, I opened the window, but now it's getting kind of hot in here. Well, I want to be sure. Now I'm second guessing myself. I was pretty sure I remembered. Ah, silly of me. I know I didn't get to that. Yeah, the letters. Okay, so the Apocalypse was the last. Okay. Our last piece of literature or division of the New Testament after the letters, and it comes appropriately, I guess, at the very end, since it's our last, is the Apocalypse of John. Apocalypsis to Ioannou. The Apocalypse of John. Okay? Written sometime between 90 and 100 AD, so it's one of our later writings of the New Testament. Not necessarily the last writing of the New Testament, but one of the later writings, scholars believe. Okay. Then again, as with everything, I wasn't there, so I don't know. It could have been written much earlier for all I know. But, that's generally when scholars will date it, from the 90s AD. It's called an apocalypse, apocalypsis. Calypso in Greek means to cover. Apo, away, so to take a covering away from something. In other words, to uncover or reveal. Okay? Which means the same thing. I think both these words have a Latin base. Yeah, I'm pretty sure they both come from Latin, but they both mean, they're different words, but they mean the same thing. The word veil. So to unveil, to uncover is an apocalypse. So the Revelation is sometimes called the book of Revelation, the book of revealing, the revelation of John. Whoever John is, that's why I have a question mark. He identifies himself by the name John, but as I told you already, John was a very common Jewish name. A lot of people named John. Okay? There was a John who was an apostle of Jesus. Is that the same John who wrote the Gospel and also wrote the book of Revelation and maybe wrote a few letters? Don't know. It doesn't say he was an apostle or that he knew Jesus in his book, the Apocalypse, and it's lost to history, Some people thought it was the Apostle John in the early church, but there were question marks even early on. I mean, the Apocalypse was accepted relatively late into the New Testament canon. Because of those questions, people weren't sure it was apostolic, it was from John. But it's also kind of a weird little book. Well, it's not that little, but it's a weird book, kind of a disturbing book. And so people weren't sure it should be in the New Testament. So it took some time for it to finally be accepted. There were some churches that did not. It was I believe, if I remember correctly, it was always accepted in the Western Church. It was the Eastern churches, a lot of them were not sure the book of Revelation should be in the canon. So what is it? What does it mean to be an apocalypse? An apocalyptic or apocalyptic literature is a type of literature genre that contains symbolic visions of the future and the supernatural. Okay? So visions of heaven, visions of the future, told in symbols. So it's got, usually apocalyptic literature has a lot of weird stuff going on, in the book of Revelation, you have the beasts, these various monsters that rise up to oppose God, the false prophet, you have various plagues on the earth, and what else? heaven, of God in heaven, and also Christ. Apocalyptic is not unique to Christianity. We have Jewish apocalyptic. I mentioned to you the book of Daniel, okay? Which maybe that's a reason why the Jews did not put it amongst the prophets. Maybe that's why they put it in the writings, the Ketuvim or Ketubim, because Daniel, most of Daniel is really apocalyptic. It's not telling a story. It tells a story in the first few chapters, but then like the next half of the book is visions that Daniel has of heaven and all sorts of things. Okay, so it's more apocalyptic literature. I think that's the only apocalypse that we have in the Old Testament is the book of Daniel. I don't think there's maybe Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel also has visions and stuff, all sorts of things. Might be able to classify it as that. But anyways, and then we have Christian apocalyptic. There's also apocalyptic literature and other, secular literature, pagan literature. Nothing religious about apocalyptic literature. Usually the person who writes an apocalypse or writes in that genre is commenting on current events. Something major is happening in the history of the nation, the world, the people, whatever. And through, visions and these symbolic visions of stuff, the gods or the heavens and stuff, the person is trying to comment on what he thinks is going on, really, okay? Because of usually what's going on in heaven is more real or realer than what goes on earth for some reason. Anyway, that's the assumption. And so we have this Christian version, all right? Which might have been Jewish, actually. A lot of scholars think that whoever, the Christian who wrote this Apocalypse of John, whoever John was, seems to have based his structure and material on a pre-existing Jewish source and then Christianized it along the way. Okay, made it about Jesus. So what's going on in the book of Revelation? Well, it's a weird book. A lot of people who read it are disturbed by it because it's got all sorts of weird and wacky stuff. This is the book of the Bible where you get the famous or infamous number 666, which people associate with evil and the devil. All sorts of nasty monsters, and it's not a happy book. Let's put it that way. It's not a happy book. In the end, the message of the book is God will ultimately triumph over evil and the devil. But before that, there's going to be a lot of destruction and suffering. Okay. Anywho, so that's why people get kind of disturbed by the Apocalypse of John. But really, to me, it's a fascinating book. Read it. What do we know about it? It could be predicting the future. I remember when I was growing up in the 80s, and they had all these televangelists on television. They still do, but they had a lot more back when I was growing up in the 80s. And I'd sit there on Sundays, Herbert Armstrong, the Worldwide Church of God, or Frederick Casey Price. There's a great name for a preacher, right? Reverend Price, because everything's got a price for preaching the gospel in your life, living off. But I love Frederick Price. I liked him. He was down here in Philly. I think that's where his church was, if I'm remembering. Way back when. I'd have to look him up. He's probably dead by now. The baker. What was it? What's his name? I can see them, but I cannot remember the name. Their first name. The bakers who were stealing all sorts of donations, so they had Jim and Tammy Baker. Who else was around at that time? Well, there were a lot of televisions, and there still are, but I don't think as many, in my opinion. And I was watching them, and some of them were very apocalyptic. They're always making references to the book of Revelation. I get, especially the Worldwide Church of God, they send me little tracts in the mail, call up their number during the sessions. So they send little tracts in the mail about looking for the signs, where are the signs? What is the beast? What's the number of the beast, and who could it be? Has the false prophet been born yet? What country would he be from? Iran, maybe, or Iran. Oh, I remember Saddam Hussein, at one time was the beast. Because why did they say, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Barnett, I'm confusing it with Nostradamus. Nostradamus is supposed to predict things. Yes, that's Nostradamus. That only came up because of the first Persian Gulf War. We were at war, and all of a sudden you had these television shows talking about Nostradamus predicts some guy wearing a blue hat. And they found some picture of the dictator Saddam Hussein of Iraq wearing a blue beret or something. Close enough. It's a hat. It was bluish. No. These were Christian creatures, and oh yeah, like when we had the Soviet Union, yeah, Mikhail Gorbachev was the beast and stuff, and he even had the mark on his head. He had a birthmark, a red birthmark on his head. So that meant something. So looking for all sorts of clues in the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John, to then tie up to modern events that were happening in the 1980s to show that they're being fulfilled. The end of the world is coming. Of course, that didn't happen. So then when the 90s came, you had to find other figures that fit all of the same symbol, right? You had to come up with, and now it's the 2000s. I don't know what they're doing. I've lost, I don't pay attention anymore, so I don't know what some of the apocalyptic creatures are saying about the book of Revelation if they've given up. But biblical scholarship, if you actually read the book of Revelation, what is it talking about? Okay? Well, let's, as I said, apocalyptic was usually first concerned about what was going on in current events in history. And we kind of tell, just by reading the book oneself, you can kind of tell what probably was going on. All right? Kind of like the same stuff with Mark's Gospel. Remember, a lot of you wrote on Mark's Gospel. Oh, no, excuse me. Yeah. No, not this one. You're writing on something else. But if you read Mark's Gospel, there's a lot of stuff about suffering. Jesus seems to talk a lot about suffering for being Christian. So if you're reading between the lines, why would Mark select those sayings of Jesus or select those stories about suffering and stuff like that? Maybe because his community was suffering. This is what they wanted to hear. Maybe. And there's a lot of stuff about suffering in the Apocalypse of John. People are dying for their faith in Jesus. So there are visions of people in heaven clothed in white robes that have been washed in blood, in the blood of the Lamb, which is a symbol for Jesus. The Lamb who has been killed but is alive. Okay? And the beasts in the visions probably represent various emperors, Roman emperors of the time. And the 666 is a dead giveaway if you know it, if you know the information, you know the current events. I'm not going to get deep into it. I'm just going to show it to you because it reveals the historical background. Yes, any Iron Maiden fans? 666, the number of the beast. Yeah, this drove a lot of parents in the 80s crazy. And they wanted their kids to stay away from heavy metal because it was all satanic and stuff like that. Well, here you go. Shout, 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 shout at the devil. Motley Crue. I think a lot of it was just for shock value. Although there were some bands that were really devil worshippers, like Venom. They were very serious about it. And Anthrax. No, not Anthrax, Slayer. But other bands like Motley Crue and stuff, they were just playing games. Ozzy Osbourne was not a Satanist. But they played around with the whole occult imagery. And one of those fascinating images was this fascinating image from the Bible of the man whose name is 666, the number of the beast, this beast who's coming for the church. So we want to be ready for him, right, Ms. Taylor? So we need to know his name and identify him. So, of course, we'll give you a symbolic set of numbers, right, Mr. McMaster? So you can clearly identify the beast. Yes. Take these off. Is long hair hot?
If you have long hair, does it get hot? Speaking about guys or ladies, usually it's the ladies that have women that have long hair. It's just cultural thing, societal. But does it get hot? Do you ever get hot from it? Like your head is hot and sweaty? Well, you don't have long hair, Mr. Jastrzemski. How would you know?
I used to.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay. And it would get hot. But is that a male thing or is it also a female thing? Moving along. Anyways, you still look all right, don't you? All right. Anywho, 666. Okay, yes, in the book of Revelation, it talks about this beast who is persecuting Christians, believers in Christ, followers of the Lamb, which is a symbol for Jesus. And, just like when we talked about the Septuagint, right, Ms. Prawl? And letters are used to represent the number, right? LXX. L means 50. X means 10, right? Another X is another 10, so that brings us up to 70. This column E, LXX, so it's the 70. I don't know, which Super Bowl is it this year? L something, isn't it? Super Bowl 50 something? Is it 52 now? LII? I don't know. Which Super Bowl is it this year? Anybody know? Nobody cares? Just gonna let me die, Ms. Cobb? Just let me. So numbers, they didn't have Arabic numerals back then. They didn't have numbers like we have them now. You had to use letters in Latin, in Greek, and Hebrew. So in Greek, in which the Apocalypse was written, if you add up certain letters, if you write out a person's name and then take certain letters of that name that have numerical value and add them up, then they'll come up to 666, apparently. And that will help you identify, of course, if you know the name, but, I'm not going to tell you. You'll know the name of the beast. A lot of, Iron Maiden is wrong. This seems to be the devil, I would imagine, in hell, and the number of the beast. No, they should read their Bibles. And a lot of even Christians don't know their Bible as well as they think, because they're like, oh, it's the devil, No, it can't be the devil. 666 cannot be the number of the devil or attributed to the devil. About the beast. In 666, it says, is the number of a man, right? The number of a man is Harrison. Last I checked, the devil was an angel, a spiritual creature, without form. So the devil is an angel, a spiritual creature, not a man. And angels don't have any sex, male or female. They're genderless because they don't need to reproduce. They're not physical. So yeah, it can't be a man. It can't be the devil, because the devil's not a man. So that's right out of there. Thank you, Iron Maiden. Nice heavy metal song. Kind of creepy, but wrong. It kind of sours the song on. I've never really listened to the song, but I've heard parts of it. But it would kind of, as a metalhead, still sour me on the song. It's based on what is just not right. It's not correct. That's not what the text says. Okay? So we're looking for a man. The author tells us what we're looking for. Now, what man at that time conjured, if our assumption is correct, that these various beasts or monsters that are presented symbolically are symbols of, say, leaders of the Roman Empire, okay, let's go through their names and find out one that maybe fits. And there is one that does. Nero, Caesar.
60s, who did kill a lot of Christians. Who killed a lot of Christians. And if you write out Nero in Greek, it also works with Hebrew as well, I think. Actually, it's originally Hebrew. Yeah, I think it's Hebrew. God bless you. If you write out his name in Hebrew and take the letters in Hebrew according to their numerical values, they add up to 666. That seems to be, Mr. Barnett, more than a coincidence. Okay? What kind of clinches it for me is further evidence that we have from manuscripts of copies of the Book of Revelation. It's one of our a fragment from one of our earliest copies, though it's not on the board yet. Sorry. Is this on the PowerPoint that you have? Is this showing on the PowerPoint that you have, or did I omit it? I might have omitted it. Is anyone looking at the PowerPoint? Ms. Mackerlane, Ms. Senior, Mr. McKillop. You can tell me. I'm not going to get angry or anything. I'm not putting you on the spot. Just, is anyone looking at the PowerPoint and can tell me? What's that, Mr. Jastrzemski? Are you on the PowerPoint? Kind of, maybe. Very non-committal. That's all right, sir. You have the right to remain silent. That is your constitutional right.
Are you asking? Are you asking the translation?
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you, Saracen. Appreciate that. Yeah, this is an early papyrus. Let me see if I even wrote down its date. Let me see if I have its date here. Oh yeah, the 280s AD. Papyrus Oxyrhynchus LXVI 4499. Anyways, it's one of the early, it's from one of our earlier copies that we have. And right here, you can see it right here, the numbers written out. Okay, 616. This is in Greek, so the numerical value of these numbers are 616. Okay, 616, and I guess it's an abbreviation. They're not writing out not writing out the whole word 616. So you write a line over it to show it's an abbreviation, I think. But anyways, 616. Okay, so we do have manuscripts where it's not 666, it's 616. Why is that a clincher, Mr. Barnett? Because if you spell Emperor Nero's name just without one letter in Hebrew, then it comes out to 616. Now, I can accept one coincidence. I think coincidences happen. Stuff just, in our world, I know God wills everything, but, the world's moving around. Yeah, you ever have it happen when you're driving somewhere, you're going out, driving around Philly or something, whatever, doing something, or here in Winton Valley, and you drive by like one of your brothers or sisters or your parents in the other car, and you pull up to each other at a light or something, and you look over and there's your dad, or there's your sister, or there's your brother. Has that ever happened to you? Anyone? Huh?
Never pulled up.
Right, there, right? Or you go to Target or Walmart or whatever, job lot, and you go around the corner and there's your cousin or there's your dad or mom. Oh, well, I didn't know you were coming here. Ever happened? Yeah, it's a coincidence, but it's weird, It's weird that you would think to go to the same place. Or this doesn't happen anymore. I don't think it can happen anymore, but it did in the old days when you actually had a landline phone where you pick up the phone to make a phone call and the person would be on the other end already. You picked up the person at the moment that the person called you, you picked up the phone. You didn't know they were calling, and it's exactly the person you were going to call. And they just called you. I don't think you can do that on cell phones anymore. You can butt call, but that's not the same thing. That's weird. I mean, what are the odds of that? That's weird. So coincidences happen. But when they start happening on the same type of thing over and over again, you keep bumping into your cousin. You go from job lot and you go, I don't know, you stop by Dunkin' Donuts to get a coffee or something on the other side of town, and who's behind you? Your cousin, Oh, okay. You drive
driving around, you go into other places, other stores, other places. And every now and then your cousin's there again. And a lot of times people, you might say, are you following me? Or it might be, is he following me? Especially if it's someone that, you don't maybe have a familial relationship to, or even a nice, like an ex, you know what I'm saying? Your ex starts showing up all over the place. Maybe it wasn't a good breakup. So now you're kind of maybe worried, is she following me? Is he following me? Stalking. I don't know if that's a big thing now. It was a big thing like in the 90s. Anyways. So I personally think that that's more than a coincidence because we have extra evidence from other manuscripts and copyists. So it's like the copyist knew 666 is probably the original text. So how do we get to 616? Okay, then it's a mistake. But why would the copyist make that mistake? Because they thought that, no, they're misspelling Nero's name. Nero killed a lot of Christians. So it also gives us a baseline of around what time the book of Revelation might have been, certainly what it's referring to, but also when it might have been written at its earliest. I mean, it couldn't be earlier than Emperor Nero in the 60s. So maybe the book is as early as the 60s, although most scholars say no. All right. So that's what's going on there, okay? He has a vision and is given symbolic information about this historical figure who's been killing Christians, and he gives us a symbolic name for him, the 666. Why 6? Because 7 in Hebrew is the number of perfection. Why? I don't know. It's the number of perfection. So you take away 1 from 7, you get 6. So that's the number of imperfection. Okay, I guess because you couldn't cut 7 in half, you couldn't do like 3.5. I guess that wouldn't work. It wouldn't really make a good horror movie, right, Mr. McKillop? 3.5, 3.5, 3.5, the number of the beast. That doesn't really work. Even as a tattoo on a little kid's head, really work. All right. Nero, yeah, there's a statue. That might be what he actually did look like. But anyways. Not all that glitters is gold. That's a phrase that comes, maybe you've heard it before, it comes from Shakespeare. I believe it's The Merchant of Venice. Not all that glitters is gold. So Mr. Dunn's, or Dr. Dunn's, not all that glitters is gold principle. Talking about the canon, okay? People wrote things about Jesus. We already know this, right? People talked about Jesus. He was important to them. They continued talking about him, their encounter of him, if they knew him, their encounter of others who knew Jesus, or if they didn't know anybody, their encounter of Jesus just in their life spiritually, yeah? They're spiritual because they believed Jesus was risen. He was still alive, so they could spiritually encounter him. And people told the stories that they knew about Jesus or wrote stories, maybe wrote stories about things they wanted to know about Jesus. What was Jesus like as a little child? Was he a little wiener? Did he have any friends? What kind of games did they play? What were the apostles like? Usually, we don't have stories about where the apostles came from. Usually, people were fascinated by where did they go after? Like, where did they all travel? So there are traditions, like in your NABRE. I wonder if they still have this map. They used to in the old days. Maybe it was in Acts of the Apostles. They would have this map. Let me see if they still have it. Those are Paul's journeys. Yeah, picture a map of the Roman Empire, but that's not what I'm looking for. Let's see here. Do-do-do-do. 23, 20. Oh, it is 26. Thank you, Mr. Hinkle. You were correct. Letter to the Romans, the letters. All right, we would have had it before Acts. I remember in my old Bibles, the old New American Bibles, they had it before Acts. We would have it at the end. Let's see here. Bible dictionary. Let's see here. No. Oh well. I wish they had a list of the maps at the front of the Bible, but I don't think they give a list of maps and things. Just the books. Let's see. Give me a second. Well, anyways, in older Bibles, New American Bibles, they used to have this map which would show the traditional locations where each of the 12 apostles was supposed to have gone. Okay, and I remember like Matthew, St. Matthew, I think, was said to have gone to like Armenia, the ancient nation of Armenia. Thomas, St. Thomas the Apostle was said to have gone to India, over to India. Simon Peter went to Italy, to Rome, where he died. Paul went to Rome, where he died. Yeah, they're only showing Paul's journeys here. I'm going to show it. And I forget what the Bartholomew went to, I think, also to Armenia and stuff like that. Went to France. Spain with St. James. Not James, which James was it? I don't think it was James, the son of Zebedee. But anyways, I think it was James of son of Alphaeus. But anyways, they used to have a map. So people were fascinated by that. So you have all sorts of books written by Christians about like, where did the apostles go after Jesus? Where did they travel? They tell us, so the Acts of Thomas, or the Acts of Peter and Paul, the Acts of Bartholomew. Okay, and they're basically telling stories. I mean, these people were probably not there, so they weren't recording history, and they weren't getting it from somebody. They're just making up stories because people wanted to know. They were curious. What was the mother of Christ? What was Mary, the mother of Christ, like as a child? And stuff like that. They were all curious about these things. So you have to remember, according to this principle, not all that glitters is gold. Okay, like when you were a little kid, maybe you were digging around and you found a little piece of stone and there was some shiny yellow stuff in it and you thought that might have been gold. Yes? And you show it to dad or mom and they say, what? No, it's not gold. It looks like it, but it's fool's gold. Yes? Ever hear that saying? It's fool's gold? No? Just because it's yellow and shiny and it's a metal doesn't mean that it's gold. Okay? My hair. Look at my hair. I think I'm doing it lopsided. How should I be doing it? Should I be doing it like that? Should it be like on the side? Or should it be like that? I might take it off because it's getting hot. Woo! Nah, you gotta suffer for your art, right? You just wanna, there we go. I think I have that on the side. Okay. I think that's more like the way it's supposed to be. So just because, stories about Jesus are great, or even better if they're true, if they're rooted in reality. But, honestly, just because it's a story about Jesus doesn't get me all hot and bothered and excited, like, oh, wow, and I don't think it has to be true just because it mentions characters from the Bible. Just because people wrote things about Jesus or the apostles or in the name of an apostle doesn't mean that those writings, Mr. Jastrzemski, are ipso facto, by that very fact, Ms. Diaversa, inspired, the inspired word of God, a revelation from God. It does not follow that they should be in the New Testament or the Old Testament just because they mention these people, even Jesus. Because as I told you, in some cases, it seems pretty clear that people were just telling stories about Jesus and the apostles to fill in gaps where the tradition was silent. People wanted to know. Like, as I said, what was Jesus like as a little boy or a baby? And so, for example, we have the famous infancy gospel of Thomas. We have a couple of these, or a few of these things show up, by different people, called infancy gospels. They're all about, well, Jesus as a baby, and a little kid. What was Jesus like? Because the gospels tell us next to nothing about what Jesus was like, right, Mr. McMaster? I mean, which gospels tell us anything about the infancy or early boyhood of Jesus? Which one? Which ones are the four? Ms. Collin. Which gospels give us stories about the birth of Jesus? All of them?
True.
None of them? Is it a trick question? What do you think? I'm more agile than I look. I got you, sir. Let's see what happens here. What do you think, Ms. Collin? You don't know? No? You don't know? What do you think, Mr.
Matthew.
Matthew and Luke, yeah. And I didn't say this, but let me just see if you might know. Let's test your knowledge. Which of the four gospels gives us the only one that gives us a story about Jesus as a child? Not as a baby, but later as a young boy. The finding in the temple, if it helps. Jesus is found in the temple. He stays behind. Gets lost in the temple. He doesn't get lost, but parents lose him. As will happen with you as parents, it's terrifying. You lose your kid. Turn around for a second, and when the kid decides to go off, you turn back and the kid's gone. Jesus did the same thing. Which gospel? Why do you say that? Okay, you're guessing. Okay, that's fine. Guessing. All right, you got four to guess from. That happens to be right. Luke. Luke is the only one who told us that story. La-da-da-dee-da-da-dee-dee. Who's playing? Is that a football game? Who's playing?
Yeah.
Are they playing now?
No, it's really fun.
Huh?
It's really fun.
You didn't get to see it? So you're watching it now? How you doing, Miss Senior? What is that?
Sudoku?
Oh, Sudoku, yeah. Well, that's numbers. I can't handle numbers. I'm not good at that. Well, logical thinking like that. Isn't that how it works? You give you numbers and you have to figure out. And yeah, when it comes to logical stuff like that. Well, good. Keeps your brain active. So the infancy gospel of Thomas. Why is it the infancy gospel of Thomas? Well, I guess it was written by someone named Thomas. But it's actually about Jesus. Okay? And yeah, it's about Jesus as a baby and a little kid. It's interesting. Has some rather interesting stories about Jesus. There's one famous one at the beginning. I should have brought that book with me. I have a book at home with stuff like information like this. And I could have read it from you, but I'll give it to you from memory. Where Jesus is playing, he's a little kid, and he's playing in Nazareth, and he has he's making little mud, taking some mud and making little birds out of it, or little figures and stuff like that, which I guess could be considered kind of idolatry. You're making images, which as a Jew, you're not supposed to, of anything on the earth. And I think someone criticizes the little kid Jesus for doing that, and Jesus is like, "Oh, really?" And he just and the clay or mud birds come to life. They turn into real birds and go and fly away. Tell me what to do. I'm the Son of God, right? He's showing his power. However, you don't want to mess with him, because there's another instance where kid is running through the town and Jesus is there, and he runs into Jesus. He smacks into Jesus, and I forget if he pushes Jesus down or whatever. But anyway, but he runs into Jesus. He's running. He's not paying attention. He's running through the town, the village, and that makes Jesus angry. So Jesus kills him, wills him to be dead. The kid just dropped, boom, like a bag of hammers. This kid falls over dead. And the parents come out and they find their child dead, and they they go to Joseph and they, Jesus' father, wink, wink, and say, Joseph, you got to control this kid. He's out of control. He's killing people. You got to do something about this. And Joseph's kind of like, what can I do? Because he knows he's God in flesh. And Jesus hears the parents complaining and says, like, to the father, how dare you criticize me? Don't you know who I am? May your right hand wither, blah, 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 blah. And the guy's right hand, becomes crippled at that very moment. Kind of a peculiar image of Jesus, don't you think? Kind of weird and unusual. Not the kind of Jesus we're known or supposed to expect from the Gospels. The Jesus who is compassionate, caring, supposedly slow to anger. Although in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus does get, annoyed quite a bit. If you read the Gospel of Mark, he does get annoyed somewhat. But not to that level of willing people to be dead. So it was weird. Other stories like, I haven't come to that yet. It's not on the PowerPoint, but you have, for example, the Acts of Pilate. They're supposedly copies of letters that Pontius Pilate wrote back to the emperor in Rome about the trial of Jesus. Or there's the trial of Pilate. Pilate is put on trial by the Roman emperor for having killed Jesus, having sent him to the cross when he knew he was innocent. And now all these natural disasters are happening. The moon's turned to blood and earthquakes. So Pilate's put on trial. I think it's all fake. Most scholars would say, the great majority would say, these are fake. These are forgeries. There's some Christian writing the story to make a point. We don't have any of the records of the Romans in Palestine, or in most places that they ruled, if they kept records, which they probably did, but we have no knowledge that that Pilate kept a record of Jesus' trial, even so. But someone wanted to know what really happened to Pilate afterwards. Did Pilate become a believer? Some of these stories have Pilate becoming a Christian convert. And this still persists among some Christians. I think it's the church in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian church honor Pontius Pilate as a saint, or at least his wife as a saint, converted, based on these legends. Now, you got to be careful. Some Christians really need to be more skeptical, I think, in a good way. So yeah, people wanted to tell stories about Jesus. They wanted to fill in, gaps about the stories of Jesus, but also other gaps. So, for example, and this is also not in the PowerPoint, we know that Paul wrote more letters than the 13 that are found in the New Testament. Okay, because he mentions another letter that he wrote to a church in a place called Laodicea, which is, again, in Turkey, ancient Turkey. All right. In Western Turkey, which I showed you the other day. Well, we don't have that letter. We don't have a copy of it. It's not, no, we don't have it anymore. It's been lost. It wasn't, if it was saved, it's been lost. Okay? So, what can you do? Make one. Make it up. So some Christian did. We have lo and behold, Miss Crystal, after a certain period of time, a letter to the Laodiceans appears in the name of Paul, which is clearly a true forgery. It's not even Paul using a secretary. It could be by Paul. If I'm wrong, then I'll find out in the Great Indian Buffet in the Sky. But, it seems to be clearly a forgery. Someone basically copied little phrases from other letters of Paul, by Paul, and threw them into this and just put them together. There's nothing really even original about the letter. They're all statements from his other letters that are attributed. And a lot of people knew that the letter to the Laodiceans was false. So there's that evidence. Early Christians knew, beware of the letter to the Laodiceans. It says it's by Paul, but it's really not. Someone made it up. Nevertheless, I mentioned the Ethiopian Christian, right? The Roman Catholic, the Western Church, the popes who should know better. In some Latin manuscripts of the New Testament in the Western Church, yes, the letter of Laodiceans is found included in the New Testament with the letters of Paul. Now, of course, later, we have Pope St. Innocent I in the Synod of Rome, which said, no, these are not, so stop reading them as scripture. But for a period of time, there were people who, did think that, this was a true letter of Paul. It's probably not. Letter to the Laodiceans. But people wanted to know. Paul mentioned it, someone couldn't imagine that the letter would not have been saved. So they created it from his other letters. Well, I would hazard a guess. I don't know. But I would hazard a guess that there are a lot of writings from Paul the Apostle, I should say a lot, but there are writings from the apostles that were in existence that have been destroyed, lost, whatever, and may still be found. But because any archaeologist will tell you, they haven't dug up the whole world. Archaeology only started like a couple hundred years ago. And I had a friend who was doing archaeology when I was doing my PhD up in Toronto. He was telling me about, you have colleges and universities that have warehouses or basements full of stuff from archaeological digs that still haven't been gone through. Millions and millions, maybe even tens of millions of bits and pieces of manuscripts, pottery, usually it's pottery, statuary, all sorts of stuff that just hasn't been gone through because, to write the site, the archaeologist, it's one person, right? He's the one or she is the one that has to write the site report. And they just write on the major things, the things that really pop out and are obviously important. But all the thousands and thousands, even millions of bits of other stuff, they don't have the time to go through and catalog every little bit of pottery. That's just not that important. Yeah, it comes from an ancient pot. It's X millimeters long by X millimeters wide. It takes time to do this. So that's why you have like interns and people like that, archaeology students, let them do that. But even then, they don't have a lot of them. That's a limited resource. So it sits there. So, yeah, maybe someone will find another letter by St. Paul, which is probably authentic. Although, we have early Christian writings that mention a lot of the stuff that was floating around. Probably find something that was already mentioned. So yeah, and that's happened in some cases. We only knew the name of a writing, and then like in the 1800s or 1880s at some archaeological dig or in the library of some really old monastery, someone's just started digging around in the manuscripts and found something like, oh, wait, we have this now. This was here. We have a copy of it. Or they find a translation, like an Armenian or something. In other cases, we have groups of writings that might be Christian, but might not be Christian at all, but use Jesus as their mouthpiece for their teachings, which are not Christian. Groups like the Gnostics, okay? There were Christian Gnostics, but there are also Jewish Gnostics and just Gnostics in general. Who were Gnostics? How would you describe them? You might call them mystical people, but gnosis in Greek means knowledge. Encountering sacred writings, right? So I talked about language families and the Indo-European language family. This is silent now, but it used to be pronounced in English, Kano. to know something. The K used to be pronounced. Now we write it, but we don't say it anymore. But it's persisted in our written language. Gnosis, kno, all right? Exactly the same. So from the same language family, you can see these connections. So gnosis and knowledge. Gnostics were those who claimed to have knowledge. They're all about knowledge, having secret knowledge of the other world or the world itself. And if you had that secret knowledge, then you could be freed from it, freed from suffering and even death. So knowledge was the way to life, knowing the true thing. So if you knew certain formulae, magical formulae or something like that, names, the names of God, okay? Or you knew the correct handshake to give to the angel at the pearly gates. Bless you, Miss Chris. Okay? Knowledge. In these groups, these Gnostic groups, even though they were all about knowledge, Miss Prawl, they were very secretive, esoteric. Ex means out, outside, right? Exo, right? Outside, right? Ex-president means outside the presidency. You're not president anymore, right? Ex-it, to go out of something, right? All right. How you doing, Miss Cohen? So groups that are exoteric are open. They're outward about what they believe. Groups that are esoteric are inside. I don't remember which Greek preposition S comes from. But anyways, they're inside oriented. They're secretive. They don't let you know what they really believe. The Gnostics were like that. You know, to know what we believe, you have to join our group and go through our ceremonies. And they had all sorts of rituals and ceremonies that you went through to join their group. Okay? Some of them were very similar to Christian ceremonies. So yeah, you had some groups that were kind of Jewish-oriented Gnostics. There were some that were Christian-oriented, some that were just Gnostics, period. And since everything was about knowledge, the mind, they were very much anti-body as well. Okay? You needed to feed the mind, not the body. And sometimes they took that very literally. You know, they were very, like I should say, purging or purgative of the body. You know, the body was seen as like a prison of the mind. So you had to kind of deny the body all the pleasures that the body wants. Food and stuff like that. Food and drink and sex. Sex is a big one. A lot of Gnostic groups did not have marriage. They did not condone marriage because it used more flesh, more humans, human bodies. So you cultivated the mind so that you could liberate the mind from the body. So the flesh was bad. The material world was evil in some cases. In the extreme Gnostics, it was evil and not good at all. So you had Christian Gnostics. And they would put their teachings in the mouth of Jesus. So we have some of their writings, okay, where they're espousing these views. These were not the Christian views, of course. All right, and this was a problem for the early church. Just like I mentioned that guy Marcion, right? He wanted to reject the Jewish scriptures because we're all not Jews anymore, so we just throw out the Old Testament and we edit out everything about Judaism from the life of Jesus and the apostles, right? Remember? I talked about him, Marcion, Miss Kelsey. Do you remember? He created his own New Testament. In fact, ironically, he was a Christian, but he was kicked out of the church for heresy, for false teaching. He actually is the first person to create a canon, you know, not the Christian church. He creates an official canon, you know. He pushed that controversy, pushed the church into finally starting to make decisions about, okay, now we have to decide what can be read in the churches. The same thing kind of happens with the Gnostics as well. They push the issue. So we have writings like the Second Treatise of the Great Seth. A treatise is like an essay, a book, if you want, but a paper. All right, like, what you wrote for class or are going to write for class. It's kind of a treatise, a paper. It's the second one. I don't know what the first one was. Of the great Seth. Seth is one of the Egyptian gods. I think it was written in Egypt, so it's using the image of this god Set or Seth, which is an Egyptian god. I forget what he's the god of. Anyways, so it's a treatise about the great Seth, okay? And in this treatise, even though it mentions the great Seth, it's all about really Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth, okay? And if you read the second treatise of the great Seth, there's this famous scene of, Jesus is carrying the cross to his crucifixion, okay? If you remember the story, or even if you don't, if you've been to a Catholic church during Holy Week, maybe you're in the youth group and they had, the living stations of the cross, the living stations of the cross, they reenact Jesus carrying the cross, and some of you know that. I remember during one of the stations, there's this dude that eventually helps Jesus pick up his cross and carry it for a period of time. Okay, it's called St. Simon of Cyrene. Cyrene was a city or a town in Libya. We sing St. Simon. We don't know anything else about him, but apparently he did help Jesus carry the beam of the cross along part of the way. That's what the gospel says. Who knows? Anyways, I'll believe it. I'm not saying I won't believe it. Yeah, okay, fine. What if I find out that, didn't happen? It's not a major part of the story, but it's a nice part of the story. This guy, Simon, helps Jesus carry his cross for a little bit. So yeah, in the second treatise of the great Seth, it retells this story of this dude, this man, helping Jesus, who is really, divine knowledge, who seems to be human. Okay? He's not really human. Because remember, they're Gnostics. They don't like the flesh or the physical. Jesus is a divine spirit. He is God, but he only appears to be. He looks human. So, of course, he can't be killed. He's not going to be. So as he's carrying the cross and they get to Mount Calvary or the hill or whatever where they're going to crucify Jesus, or the soldiers think they're going to nail Jesus to the cross, he clouds their mind so that they don't see him anymore. They see Simon, who's helping him carry the cross, yeah? And they take Simon and crucify him instead, thinking it's Jesus. Jesus just dematerializes, because remember, he's a spirit, right? He's not really human from the Gnostic point of view. So he dematerializes and he kind of like hovers over the cross, laughing at them, how foolish and stupid they are, that he was able to trick them, that they killed the wrong person. Okay? You can see why the church had some problems with that, right, Ms. Cobb? Because the church, no, Jesus was flesh. He was truly man. And he was killed. Yeah, but he's God. How can God die? We don't know. But that's the encounter. Again, that's encountering sacred writings. Encountering sacred writings, we're encountering a person, right? An encounter is more of a person. We encountered him. He acted like God, but he was human. And we don't know how. I mean, remember, these were Jews. This would not have occurred to them. They believed in one God only who was completely spiritual. They were not, this was not within their worldview, generally speaking. In fact, they were opposed to that kind of worldview. They categorically rejected. But anyways, we don't know how. But we know the Gnostics are wrong. They're denying this. They're saying that, no, God never did appear amongst us as Jesus, but he was not really flesh. He was an illusion. An illusion. And this shows it because, he had this real man crucified in his place. He disappeared. So this has repercussions for Christianity, because if they're right, if the Gnostics are right, these Gnostic Christians are right, then Jesus' body didn't really rise from the dead. Jesus just dematerialized and went back to the heavenly realm where he came from, right? That's what the resurrection is for the Gnostics. Jesus didn't die. He didn't come back from the dead. He simply was re-glorified. He went back into his glory, the glory that he always had from the beginning, right? So what does that mean for us if you're a Christian? What does it mean for any human being? It means that death was really never vanquished. It takes out the whole message of Christianity, which is death. Death, where is your sting? You know, where is your power, death? You have no, yes, we die, but because of Jesus rising from the dead, we know that God will bring us back. I mean, technically, our souls are immortal anyways, but bring us back with our bodies. But that was a bad thought for the Gnostics. Who wanted to come back with your body? Your stinky, rotten body, The body is the problem. No, you want to be spirit. You want to get rid of the body. But for the church, it's like, no, the resurrection of the flesh. Those of you who are Catholic and go to Catholic Mass, the creed, right? I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Does this sound familiar to some of you? I mean, read what you think of what you say at the very end of the creed. What does it say? Get to the Holy Spirit. I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. I believe in one baptism for the forgiveness of sins. I look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Literally, they can say dead. Literally in the Latin, it's I believe in the resurrection, the rising of the flesh. Specific, not just dead, but flesh, the body. Why does the church have to be specific about that? Because there were some Christians who denied that, Gnostic Christians. So yeah, that was a problem. People were putting their own heterodox or incorrect teachings from the point of view of the church into the mouth of Jesus. So some people might have believed that. So there's a number of reasons. Why do I have the Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter? Is that the one where, is it the Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter? I forget what example I have from that. Is that the example from, no, what does Peter do? All right, forget about the Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter. I think I'm right about the second treatise of the Great Set. Anyways, so what did the church do? We had to have standards. So here are 4 standards that the church looked at. 4 criteria for whether a writing the church should take notice of it as belonging in her canon. So for the first and major point was apostolicity. Does it derive from an apostle? If you can establish it does directly come from one of the apostles, like Paul or Simon Peter or one of the 12, then yes. Then it's very far on its way to being accepted as divinely inspired, just because it comes from an apostle. But as I think I've shown you already, in many of the books of the Bible, whether Old Testament or New Testament, the authors are not identified. We have traditions about who wrote them, but we can't prove them necessarily. And the church has known that for a long, long, long time. So it has to rely on tradition, what's been handed on as coming from the apostles. But it can't necessarily be the only criterion, because we know that we can't 100% identify some of the writings as apostolic. Okay? It does not mean that it had to have been directly written by an apostle. I think that I've made that apparent. But it should in some way come from an apostle. He dictated the letter. Or like in the case of Mark's gospel, Mark was writing down what he heard Simon Peter preaching and the stories he was telling about Jesus. In some cases, the apostle may have written it directly, but it doesn't have to be that way. Also, acceptance. Do the most prominent and the most ancient churches accept the writing? So you look to some of the most ancient Christian communities that have been around. In some cases, been around before the writings. Rome, Jerusalem, of course. The church in Jerusalem. Antioch. People forget about Antioch, which is also in Turkey. Rome, yes. Alexandria in Egypt, where the source of the Septuagint. Okay, so there's a big Christian community there that's very, very old. So you look to some of these communities, have they accepted it? Told you like the book of Revelation. The Rome accepted the Apocalypse of John as inspired scripture. I think mainly because it thought that it came from the Apostle John, but whatever. But some of the other churches in the East did not. Okay? So again, universal acceptance cannot be the only criterion because, yeah, you might have some writings where there is disagreement, like the Revelation of John, the Apocalypse of John. Okay? It might come from an apostle. It might be accepted by a lot of the churches, but not all. So what else do you look for? Faithfulness. Okay? Does it faithfully represent the Jesus that the church knew? Was Jesus a nasty little bastard as a child? You know what I'm saying? A nasty little wiener. Well, we knew him as an adult. He could have been. But is that the Jesus that we knew? Yeah. I still got 2 minutes. No, I don't? Okay. All right, so I'll stop here and I'll finish up with this next week. All right. The senior pulled the rug out from underneath me, so there you go. Miss Senior. Okay. Countering sacred writings. Da-da-da-dee-dee-dee-dee.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sir. Did you?
What?
Were you listening?
Yes, sir.
Were you listening at all?
Yes, sir.
All right. Oh, my children.
Take a picture.
Oh, yeah.
Wait, what's your favorite song by?
Huh?
Who is this guy?
Again? What guy?
Like you're supposed to.
Oh, I'm just me, a Christian heavy metal guy from the 80s.
No, it's not.
Yeah. No, it's not anyone in particular. No, just Christian heavy metal. You had to have long hair, big poofy hair in the 80s. You know, long hair. Had to have the studs, the sadomasochistic element. You know. I mean, if I were true to form, I would have worn spandex, which I have, but I thought that might be a little bit
Too broad.
I don't want any Title IX, complaints. So.
Very good.
Have a good day.
I mean,
Enjoy yourselves.
Have a good day.